Good afternoon. Humility is one of the great Christian virtues, but when humility is imposed on someone rather than being something that rises from within them, well, that's anything but humility. In such cases, a call to be humble is simply a polite way to shut people up and to prevent them from enjoying the fullness of life that God desires. So let's begin first with a definition of humility. What does it mean to be humble? Many people have this false notion that humility means thinking poorly of yourself, that being humble means, oh, I don't matter all that much, I don't have anything of value to offer. We think that a humble person is someone who never looks up, someone who never tries to stand up. But that is not humility. God never calls upon us to think ourselves as nothing but worms. No, I prefer the definition of humility that we find in Romans chapter 12, verse 3. Do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment, in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you. Now, we know what the opposite of humility is: pride, hubris, egotism, the belief that you're greater than you actually are. And this becomes a real problem when you expect other people to treat you this way. So the first step toward humility is to set aside such prideful notions. But that's only the first step, because you can go too far and think too lowly of yourself. Rather, Romans tells us, think of yourself in sober judgment. Take a good long look at yourself. Who are you? What are you capable of? And as you do so, consider what gifts God has given to you. Because God has equipped and blessed you in a certain way. He's done so in a way that is unique for each of us. False humility denies these gifts. False humility tries to keep them under wraps. Yeah, you don't want to think too highly of yourself after all, that's true. But it is just as much of a problem if you think too lowly of yourself. True humility is an honest assessment of your abilities, your gifts, and your blessings, and it is a consideration of the best way to use them. Unfortunately, far too many people not only exercise false humility, but they try to force false humility on other people and to try to keep them in their place. Some people try to keep others from getting uppity. And I was shocked a few years ago to find out where that word uppity actually comes from. It emerged from the Jim Crow South as whites were trying to keep blacks in their place, or what they thought was their place. A black person was accused of being uppity if they tried to improve life for themselves, maybe to have a business of their own, maybe to go to school, maybe to move into a nicer house. Anytime a black would try to do that, others around them would say, well, you're just being too uppity. And they were sometimes brutally put back into what other people thought was their place. They're getting too cocky. They need more humility. We see the same thing happen in Mark chapter 10. When Jesus came to the city of Jericho, there was a huge crowd that was greeting him enthusiastically. And that crowd included a blind beggar known as Bartimaeus. Bartimaeus, by the way, wasn't his name. Bartimaeus simply means son of Timaeus. No one even cared enough to ask this man what his name was. But Bartimaeus shouted for Jesus to have mercy on him. And as he shouted, everyone around him rebuked him and told him to be quiet. In other words, remember your place. Quit being so uppity. You're nothing but a blind beggar. Be humble. Don't put on airs and think that you're important enough for Jesus to notice you. That's how everyone else treated Bartimaeus. They wanted him to be humble, according to their definition of the word. But Bartimaeus refused to be shushed. So he shouted even louder until Jesus noticed him and Jesus healed him. So, to end this devotion, I have two questions. First, who are you shushing? Who are you telling not to be uppity? Who are you telling that they need to be humble and remember their place? Ask yourself, is it really my job to tell them where their place is? Or is it up to them to consider themselves with sober judgment? And then my second question is this: when do you shush yourself? Or when do you have other people shush you? That is, when do you deny the right place that you have in God's plan? And when do you allow other people to deny you that place? That is not humility. Humility means considering yourself soberly and can think about what gifts God has given you to use. Would you pray with me, please? Lord God, we are well aware of people who could certainly use a good dose of humility. Those who are so full of themselves that they think that the world revolves around them. But just as dangerous, although not nearly as noticeable, are the people who engage in false humility. Those who think too poorly of themselves. Those who do not take into account the blessings that you have given to them. Spare us, Lord, from false humility, just as we ask you to spare us from false pride. Help us to consider who we are with sober judgment. And help us, Lord, to be people who encourage others to consider themselves this way, rather than to think that we have the right to tell them what their place is. Because you had a place for Bartimaeus, and that was at your side as your beloved child. That is a place that you have for us all. And for this we give you thanks. Amen. Thanks for joining me. We'll talk again later.